There are mornings on the Wyoming prairie when the world feels paused between breaths. The sky hangs close, bruised with mist, and the grass bends low under a silver frost. Hannah Prescott always felt most at home in these empty hours, when the sun was just a rumor behind the clouds and the wild earth seemed to wait for something. She moved quietly, her boots barely disturbing the dew as she combed the riverbank for driftwood, the only sound the gentle clink of the pieces she gathered for her work. Her hands, strong and deft from years spent shaping silver, felt awkward and strange when they weren't creating. It was easier to focus on her craft than the hollow ache left by the family she'd lost, the house too big and the world too silent. That morning, the silence wasn't empty, it was loaded. The mist thickened as she stepped farther from her cabin, swallowing fences and landmarks until she might have been the only soul alive for miles. She knelt to examine a gnarled branch, imagining the delicate inlay it could become, when a sharp, desperate sound split the fog. It wasn't a coyote's yip or an eagle's cry. It was a whinny, raw, wild, pleading. Hannah froze. Her heart stuttered, then raced as she turned toward the sound. She knew these lands and their secrets, the deep arroyos, the hidden draws, the herds of wild mustangs that roamed just beyond sight. There were old legends about the horses. Some folks swore they were spirits, others just called them a nuisance. But Hannah had always felt a kinship with their loneliness. Another cry, louder now, closer. The fog pressed in, distorting shapes. Branches reached out like hands. Hannah moved fast, the driftwood forgotten, the silver knife at her hip suddenly weighty and real. She ducked beneath a barbed wire fence, the cold metal scraping her coat. Somewhere ahead, something was suffering. She found the Mustang in a shallow hollow, half hidden by sage and mist. The horse was young, a stallion maybe, its coat a stunning silver gray that gleamed even in the dull dawn. It thrashed against the barbed wire, blood streaking its flank, foam flecking its muzzle. Its eyes rolled wide with terror, wild, pleading, refusing to give in. Hannah's breath caught. She crept closer, her hands raised, voice low and steady. "Hey, it's all right. It's all right." The horse bared its teeth, ears pinned flat. Each time it tried to rise, the barbs tore deeper. The air was thick with the smell of fear and iron. She had to move fast. Kneeling in the mud, she pulled the silver knife from her belt. Her father's knife, with the Prescott crest still visible on the handle. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the memory of him showing her how to sharpen a blade, how to use it for good. "Okay, just breathe. You're all right. Stay with me." The Mustang's flanks shivered. She saw the wound, deep, ragged, oozing. If she waited for help, the horse would bleed out or break its own leg. No one else was coming. She pressed her left hand to the animal's neck, feeling the frantic pulse, and whispered nonsense. Soft, steady, anything to keep it grounded. With her right, she worked the knife into the knot of wire. The horse jolted, almost knocking her over. "No, easy, easy!" She ducked a flying hoof, heart hammering. The wire dug into her palm, slicing skin. Blood welled, but she kept going, jaw clenched. "You can't leave me now. Come on, fight, but don't fight me." The wire gave with a sharp twang. The horse jerked, eyes wild. Hannah kept talking, her voice low, the words spilling out in a stream. "I know it hurts. I know. I'm here." Another wire, this one worse, tangled tight around the fetlock. She saw old scars on the animal's legs, a testament to a life lived dodging dangers most people couldn't imagine. She slashed at the wire, wincing as a barb raked her arm. Her own blood mingled with the horse's, sinking into the cold mud. Almost there. Almost. The last strand snapped, curling away with a sinister hiss. The Mustang staggered, nostrils flaring. For a second it looked ready to bolt. Then its legs buckled, sending it crashing down inches from her boots. Hannah dropped the knife, hands up. She let the horse smell her, watched its sides heave. She didn't move, didn't dare. Any sudden action might send it into another panic. She could feel her own heartbeat thudding in her ears, matching the rhythm of the wounded animal. We made it. You made it. She stroked the sweat-slicked neck, feeling the tremors slowly ease. The dawn was brighter now, the fog thinning to reveal the stark beauty of the prairie. The world was waking, but Hannah and the Mustang were still caught in that suspended moment. Strangers, bound by pain and the stubborn refusal to let go. In that instant, something shifted. The wildness in the Mustang's eyes dulled just enough for trust to slip in, fleeting but real. She didn't know if the horse understood her words, or if she was really speaking to herself, but she stayed there in the muddy hollow, refusing to leave until the Mustang was calm enough to breathe. And somewhere far off, echoing through the new light, came the thunder of hooves, unseen but unmistakable. The wild was watching. The Mustang's chest still heaved with panic, nostrils flaring, blood dripping steadily onto Hannah's coat. She shrugged off her heavy jacket, pressing it firmly to the worst of the wounds, trying to stanch the bleeding. The animal shuddered under her touch, skin twitching as if even kindness was foreign. Her own arms ached from effort, her palms raw from the barbed wire. She ignored the stinging. Her focus narrowed to the horse, its labored breathing, the life it fought to keep. "Come on, big guy, stay with me." She spoke in a low, steady rhythm, the words half prayer, half command. The horse's sides trembled, but it did not bolt. Hannah gritted her teeth and leaned her weight against him, mindful not to pin the animal, but to let him feel her presence. Real, steady, unafraid. The sun was a faint promise behind shifting clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. For a moment, it felt as if the entire prairie was holding its breath. The Mustang tried to stand, its legs buckled, sending a shudder through the ground. Hannah pressed down harder, using her coat to absorb the blood. She ripped a sleeve from her flannel shirt, tying it in a crude knot just above the wound. Her hands were clumsy, slick with blood, but she forced herself to keep going, whispering encouragement. "Almost there, buddy. Almost." The horse's muscles tensed, then released. It collapsed back onto the cold earth, eyes rolling with exhaustion. Hannah stroked its neck, her own heart pounding in her ears. Then, a vibration through the ground. Faint at first, barely more than a quiver, but growing stronger. Hannah's breath caught. She glanced up and saw the mist swirl, parting in ghostly columns as shadows moved through the fog. One, then three, then half a dozen wild Mustangs emerged, their bodies barely visible, shapes shifting in and out of the morning haze. They moved in a wide, silent arc around her, hooves silent in the wet grass. Their coats shimmered. Blacks, duns, bays, a chestnut with a blaze, a paint mare with wild eyes. They carried the energy of something ancient and untamed, a presence that felt both electric and sacred. Hannah's pulse raced. She stayed kneeling, hands still on the wounded stallion, her mind scrambling between awe and a primal fear. To be surrounded by a herd of wild Mustangs, most locals never got this close. Some wouldn't dare. The horses moved in a coordinated, wordless dance, forming a tense, incomplete circle around her. Their ears flicked, nostrils flared, eyes locked on the stranger in their midst. She felt the weight of their attention, the judgment in their silence. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Alone out here, wounded, no weapon but her knife. She was at their mercy. Easy now. I'm not here to hurt anyone. Her voice was barely a whisper. The horses didn't move. A bay stallion stamped a hoof, tossing its mane with a snort. The chestnut inched forward, head lowered, muscles taut. The herd's energy was tightly wound. A single wrong movement could send them scattering or stampeding. Hannah's breath came shallow, her body tense. The silver-gray Mustang beneath her twitched, as if sensing its family close by. It lifted its head, meeting the eyes of a massive black stallion who stood at the herd's center. The black stallion was scarred, one ear notched, a white blaze running down its face like a lightning bolt. Power radiated from him, an authority that even Hannah felt in her bones. Slowly, the black stallion stepped forward, hooves silent. He stopped just a few feet away, the distance between them charged with tension. Hannah met his gaze, refusing to look away. The stallion lowered his head, a gesture of acknowledgement or warning. He pawed at the ground, then lifted his muzzle to the sky, snorting sharply. The others stilled. The wounded Mustang, her Mustang now, whickered weakly, struggling to rise. Hannah's hands moved of their own accord, cradling the animal's head, urging him to his feet. The black stallion took another step, bowing his head even lower. For a moment, it felt like a challenge, a test. Hannah met the stallion's eyes, her own filled with fear and stubbornness. I'm not leaving you, not now. She reached down, sliding her hands under the Mustang's chest, using her full strength to help him up. The animal groaned, legs shaking, but finally stood, propped awkwardly against her. The blood had slowed, but the wound still looked angry. Hannah steadied the Mustang, aware of every eye on her, every ripple of movement in the herd. The black stallion breathed out, long and slow, his posture softening. The circle relaxed, some of the tension seeping away. The paint mare came forward, sniffing at Hannah's outstretched hand. Hannah didn't move, didn't speak, barely dared to breathe. Then, in a gesture that made her throat tighten, the wounded Mustang nudged her shoulder, gentle, deliberate, grateful. The herd seemed to sense this shift. The black stallion bowed his head one last time. The paint mare brushed past Hannah, her muzzle soft and warm. Without warning, the Mustangs began to move. First the black stallion, then the others, drifting back into the mist with the wounded one trailing behind. The silver-gray Mustang hesitated, turning to look at Hannah with dark, soulful eyes. Then, as if promising they would meet again, he vanished after his herd. Hannah stood alone in the clearing, her coat drenched with blood, her shirt ripped and muddy, hands shaking from adrenaline and relief. The prairie was quiet again, the only sound her own ragged breath. She stared into the fog where the herd had gone, heart pounding, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. In that moment, she understood something she'd always suspected. The wild has its own code, its own language, and sometimes, just sometimes, it lets you in. The mist lifted slowly, and Hannah Prescott stood in the new light. Changed. The prairie looked different when Hannah stumbled home. Her legs felt hollow, her breath thin as if she'd run a marathon. Every sound was louder. The creak of the porch step, the rusty groan of the screen door, the soft thud as she let her muddy boots drop inside the entryway. Her cabin felt smaller, closer, almost unfamiliar after that morning's brush with the wild. She stood in her kitchen, shivering in her torn flannel shirt and blood-stained jeans, not entirely certain if what she'd experienced was real or some half-remembered dream. The silence closed in. She scrubbed her hands at the sink, watching the water turn pink before it swirled away. Her fingers throbbed where the barbed wire had bitten into her palms. She found an old first aid kit, patched herself up with shaking hands, and tried to ignore the deep ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her wounds. Her mind replayed the rescue, frame by frame, the Mustang's desperate eyes, the razor sting of wire, the raw smell of blood, the weight of the black stallion's stare. Most of all, she remembered the touch, the silver-gray Mustang nudging her, the herd gathering, the ancient ceremony of trust. She reached for her journal, flipping through pages of sketches and half-finished thoughts. Her handwriting was a tangle of emotions as she tried to put the morning into words. Saw the wild ones up close, closer than ever before, she wrote, hands still trembling. Saved one, I think. He let me touch him. The herd circled around. It felt like something holy. She paused, staring at the next page. A thin, insistent voice in her mind kept asking, was it real? Or was she losing herself out there, finally slipping into madness after all the years of grief and solitude? The ache sharpened as she remembered something else. Her father's knife, the silver one with the Prescott crest, was gone. She dropped it during the rescue, abandoned in the mud when the Mustang finally broke free. She searched her jacket, her pockets, the muddy pile of clothes by the door, but it was nowhere to be found. The loss stung more than she expected. That knife had been her last real link to her family. A tool, yes, but also a keepsake, a symbol of everything she'd inherited and lost. She slumped into her favorite chair by the wood stove, the air smelling faintly of ash and old hopes. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The day felt longer than usual, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. As dusk slipped in, Hannah stood on her porch and watched the prairie turn gold and then purple in the dying light. She found herself scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of movement, a flash of silver gray, the shifting shadow of a herd. Nothing but the endless grass, swaying as if remembering something she could not. That night, she lay in bed listening to the sounds of her house settling, the occasional distant yip of a coyote, and the even more distant thunder of hooves she wondered if she only imagined. Her dreams were feverish, full of horses and fog and the sharp electric thrill of danger. She woke before dawn, sheets tangled around her legs. For the first time in a long time, she felt compelled to move, to do something besides go through the motions of her quiet, solitary life. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her sketchbook and a thermos of coffee, and headed out into the chill air. The world outside felt alive with possibility. Hannah wandered, following the riverbank where she'd found the Mustang, then turning up through the willows and out into the wide sweep of prairie. The dew was thick, and the fog rose in ribbons from the ground. She searched for signs of the herd, hoofprints, tufts of mane snagged on a fence, anything, but all she found were the scattered feathers of a pheasant and the old scars of barbed wire. With no destination in mind, she walked for hours, letting her thoughts drift. Every so often, she paused to sketch, a willow bent by wind, a tangle of thistle, the suggestion of hooves in the grass. She was surprised by how alive she felt, her senses sharpened, her mind busy with questions and hope. It had been years since she'd felt this way. Late that afternoon, as the sun was beginning to sink, she returned home. The house greeted her with its usual stillness, but it no longer felt so oppressive. Hannah made herself a pot of soup, hands steady for the first time in days. She turned on the old radio, country music warbling and sweet, and set her sketchbook beside her on the kitchen table. That night, as she journaled about her walk and drew the herd from memory, Hannah felt something different blooming inside her. It wasn't peace, not yet, and certainly not closure. But it was hope, fragile and persistent as the prairie grass pushing through frost. The wild had touched her life in a way she couldn't explain or dismiss. As the moon rose, she stepped out onto the porch one last time. The sky was clear now, stars cold and sharp overhead. Somewhere, hidden by darkness, the Mustangs moved. She could almost hear them, the steady drum of hooves, the low whicker of comfort. She whispered a promise into the night, quiet and true. "I'll see you again," she said. "I'm not done yet." And with that vow, she turned and went inside, carrying the wild with her, determined to keep searching for what she'd lost and what she'd found. 3 days passed before Hannah worked up the courage to return to the place where she had rescued the Mustang. Each day, the urge grew stronger, an itch under her skin that nothing else could soothe. She went through the motions of daily life, fixing the loose shutter on her cabin, sorting through silver scraps, even starting a new bracelet. But her mind was always elsewhere. She kept glancing at the riverbank through her workshop window, her thoughts tangled with questions and longing. On the morning of the third day, with the autumn wind swirling leaves in little golden storms, she laced up her boots, stuffed her sketchbook and a canteen into her backpack, and set out across the prairie. The sky was huge, a canvas of pale blue streaked with clouds. Each step into the open land felt like crossing into another world, one untouched by loss or loneliness. Hannah retraced her path to the rescue site. The grass still bore signs of the struggle, tufts flattened, a dark stain where blood had soaked into the earth, a faint groove left by the Mustang's frantic movements. She stood still for a long moment, listening. All around her, the prairie seemed to hum. Insects buzzing, wind sighing, somewhere a distant hawk crying. She knelt, her hand pressing to the earth where she'd knelt before. She thought about her father's knife, how it had slipped from her hand in the chaos, swallowed by mud and panic. The memory of its loss twisted inside her, sharp and fresh. She began to search, combing through the trampled grass, checking every shadow and hollow. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last hints of mist. That's when she saw it, something out of place near a low mound beneath a scraggly juniper bush. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she drew closer, she realized what it was. On top of the mound, half buried in a layer of white, sun-bleached bones, lay her father's silver knife. The blade glinted, strangely clean despite the days exposed to the elements, its handle resting atop the small pile as if set there with intention. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. The arrangement was unmistakable, not a random scatter, but a careful display. The bones, mostly small, rabbits or prairie dogs maybe, were ringed in a circle. The knife sat perfectly centered, like an offering left on an altar. She stared, her mind racing. She looked for footprints, human or animal, but the ground was hard and dry. Only a few horse tracks, already half erased by wind. She glanced up, scanning the horizon for any sign of the herd, but the prairie was empty, the wildness holding its secrets close. Hannah knelt before the mound, reaching out slowly, reverently. Her fingers brushed the knife's handle, cold and smooth, and she shivered. She picked it up, turning it over in her hand. The Prescott crest was clear and bright. She felt as if she were touching a piece of her own past, a thread connecting her to all the stories she'd heard, all the memories she'd lost. She sat back on her heels, overwhelmed. The meaning of the arrangement was unclear. Offering, warning, or something else entirely? She only knew that it felt deliberate, a message from the wild that she had been seen and remembered. Her gaze drifted over the circle of bones, and she wondered if the Mustangs mourned their own, if they too honored the past. She imagined the herd returning here in the night, guided by instinct and memory, their hooves silent as shadows as they gathered around the mound. Maybe it was their way of saying thank you or goodbye. Hannah wiped her eyes, the weight of the moment heavy on her chest. She slid the knife into her pocket, careful not to disturb the bones. Then, unable to resist, she pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw. Her hand moved almost without thinking, lines and shadows coming together on the page. The mound, the knife, the circle, the ghostly shapes of horses watching from the mist. As she worked, a sense of calm settled over her. Each stroke of her pencil was a kind of prayer, a way to make sense of the strange language of the prairie. She lost track of time, caught up in the rhythm of creation and memory. The sun was sinking low by the time she closed her sketchbook. She stood, dusted off her jeans, and looked around one last time. The prairie felt changed, charged with a quiet energy, as if the land itself was watching. On the way home, she moved slower, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She paused to gather wild sage, twirling the aromatic leaves between her fingers, feeling the world open around her. For the first time since her family's loss, she felt something like hope, fragile, still, but blooming. That night, back in her cabin, Hannah sat by the fire and wrote in her journal. She described the offering, the knife, the sense of connection she felt, not just to the Mustangs, but to the land, to her father, to herself. She wrote about the possibility that the wild ones honored memory and pain in their own mysterious ways. She finished with a promise to keep watching, listening, recording, to respect the boundaries between worlds, but never stop seeking understanding. As she drifted to sleep, she dreamed of horses, silver and black, running through fog and firelight, always just out of reach, always leading her deeper into the wild. And when she woke, she knew she would follow. It was nearly a week before Hannah saw the Mustangs again, but in that time, the prairie had changed. She felt it in the way the wind curled over the grasses, in the uneasy hush that sometimes settled over the land just after sunset. Something was shifting, and not only in her heart. Hannah had fallen into new habits. Every morning, after she tended the chores, she set out across the prairie, always with her sketchbook and her father's silver knife. Returned now, its weight a silent promise in her pocket. She wandered without purpose, letting instinct lead her. Sometimes she found herself at the riverbank, sometimes on a lonely ridge staring out over miles of rippling grass, searching for a flicker of movement on the horizon. One afternoon, as she sketched the jagged silhouette of distant mountains, she heard them. A low, rolling thunder, so faint it seemed to rise from the ground itself. The hairs on her arms stood up. She moved quietly through the grass, following the sound as it grew, a heartbeat pounding through the earth. There, cresting a low hill, she found the herd. It was a breathtaking sight. The Mustangs moved together in a slow procession, their bodies shining in the sun. The black stallion led, his head high, scars catching the light. The silver-gray Mustang walked close behind, still limping, but stronger with each step. The herd's energy was different today, slower, solemn. There was a sense of purpose in their movement, a gravity that drew Hannah in. She kept her distance, crouching low, blending into the shadows. The herd wound their way to a secluded rise, ringed with ancient cottonwoods and sage. As they stopped, the black stallion let out a low, mournful call. One by one, the others gathered around a patch of freshly turned earth. Hannah watched, hardly daring to breathe. At the center of the gathering, an old Mustang lay still, its gray muzzle flecked with white. Around its neck was a string of beads, worn, hand-carved, gleaming with age and meaning. The herd approached in turn, touching noses to the old horse, standing in silent witness. The black stallion remained at the head, his eyes distant, proud, grieving. It struck Hannah then. This was a funeral, a ritual as ancient as the herd itself. She saw the reverence in their movements, the care with which they treated their fallen kin. There was sorrow, but also honor. When the last horse had paid its respects, the black stallion stepped forward and gently nuzzled the string of beads, then lifted his head and looked straight at Hannah's hiding place. Her breath caught. The stallion's gaze was steady, unafraid. He seemed to see her, not as a threat, but as a witness, someone meant to understand what she was seeing. In that moment, Hannah felt an overwhelming respect for the herd's ways, for the traditions they carried in silence and strength. As the sun dipped lower, the Mustangs gathered around the old one, using their hooves to push earth and sage over the body. It was a careful, communal act, not rushed or frantic. When the task was done, the black stallion circled the mound, then led the herd away into the gathering dusk. Only the beads remained, glinting in the last light, a sacred marker. Hannah stayed hidden until long after they had gone. She moved to the burial site, kneeling beside the freshly covered mound. She traced the string of beads with trembling fingers, marveling at the intricate carvings. Some were simple shapes, suns, moons, running horses. Others were patterns she didn't recognize, but all bore the unmistakable mark of care and tradition. She realized with a start that these beads were older than they looked, some carved by hand, others worn smooth by generations. The herd, she realized, honored their dead much like humans did, passing down symbols of memory and connection. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. She sketched the mound, the beads, the setting sun. She pressed a hand to the earth, silently thanking the Mustangs for letting her witness their secret. But the peace of that moment was short-lived. By the time she made her way back to the main road, she saw trouble gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. A cluster of trucks and ATVs were parked near the barbed wire fence, men with rifles and cattle prods standing in a circle, their voices raised. Hannah stayed low, listening. The words chilled her blood. "Damn horses keep tearing up the fences, costing us money," one man spat. "They're nothing but pests," another grumbled. "We ought to round 'em up, ship 'em off, or worse." She recognized some of the faces, ranchers from town, men she'd bought supplies from for years. Now their eyes were hard, their patience spent. Hannah's heart hammered in her chest. Someone mentioned a petition to the county, demanding the wild herd be culled. They were already setting traps, stringing fresh wire, planning to drive the horses away for good. Hannah retreated, anger and fear swirling in her gut. She hurried home, slamming the door behind her. She knew the Mustangs wouldn't stand a chance against the combined force of ranchers, traps, and bullets. Sitting at her kitchen table, she stared at her hands, dirty and shaking. She could still feel the bead's cool smoothness, the trust she'd seen in the stallion's eyes. The Mustang's world was under threat, and now, so was hers. For the first time in years, Hannah felt herself swept up by something larger than her own pain. The wild ones had let her in, shown her their deepest secrets. She would not betray them. Not now. As the prairie night deepened, Hannah lit a lamp and began to write. Letters to the sheriff, the mayor, anyone who would listen. She called a handful of old friends, told them the story of what she'd seen. Some hung up, others promised to think it over. A few said they would help. She knew a storm was coming, but she was ready. The wild had chosen her, and she, Hannah, never used to think of herself as a fighter. But as the tension on the prairie sharpened into open conflict, something fierce woke up inside her. The next morning, the headlines in the local paper, "Ranchers Demand Wild Horse Removal," spread like wildfire. By afternoon, the news had become the talk of the town. The wild Mustangs, once little more than a legend or inconvenience, were now public enemy number one. Rumors swirled of bounties, secret meetings, and men eager to prove themselves with guns and trucks. Hannah knew she couldn't protect the herd alone. She called the few friends she trusted: Carol from the feed store, Mrs. Chang who ran the library, 2 birdwatchers she'd met on the riverbank. Some of them hesitated, but when she described the funeral, the beads, the wounded Mustang's trust, their skepticism faded. By sunset, a small coalition had formed, the beginnings of what Hannah would come to call her Wild Ones. Their first meeting was held at her cabin, everyone crowded around her scarred kitchen table. Carol brought a thermos of strong coffee and a sheaf of hand-drawn maps. Mrs. Chang arrived with a dusty law book and her ancient binoculars. The birdwatchers, Paul and his daughter Jamie, brought trail cameras, camo jackets, and a fierce determination. "They're going to set traps near the south fence tomorrow," Carol said, her voice tight. "They don't care about the law, just about their land and their fences," Mrs. Chang replied, thumbing through her book. Paul was already setting up a schedule for patrols, using his years of tracking experience. "If we catch them in the act, photos, video, anything, we'll have evidence for the sheriff." Hannah nodded, gripping her father's silver knife in her pocket. "We're not breaking the law," she said. "We're protecting it. And we're protecting something older than any fence or deed." The next days blurred together in a rush of action and adrenaline. Hannah was everywhere at once, scouting trails, replacing snapped wires with flags to warn off the horses, and, when no one was watching, quietly sabotaging the nastiest of the ranchers' traps. She learned to move like the Mustangs, silent, wary, leaving little trace. She marked new danger spots on Carol's maps, took down the coordinates for Paul's trail cameras, and spread word to anyone who might sympathize. But the resistance was bigger than she'd imagined. The ranchers doubled their efforts, bringing in hired hands with trucks and snares, men who looked at Hannah with cold, dismissive eyes whenever they crossed paths in town. "You're on the wrong side of this, Prescott," one grunted outside the hardware store. Hannah met his glare, refusing to flinch. "The wild's been here longer than your cattle." He spat on the ground, a wordless threat. She kept walking, heart pounding. As days turned into weeks, the battle lines were drawn. The Mustangs began to avoid the most dangerous fields, but the traps grew more cunning. Several times, Hannah and Jamie freed panicked foals, cutting them loose from wire or coaxing them from hastily dug pits. Each rescue left Hannah more exhausted, her hands raw and shaking, but she never once considered quitting. At night, she documented everything. Her journal overflowed with details, times, places, faces, words overheard at the diner. She sent emails to the local authorities, attached photos from the trail cams, and called wildlife organizations in Cheyenne and Denver. Sometimes she sat on her porch and cried from frustration, fear, and rage, but every morning she woke determined to try again. Meanwhile, her reputation began to spread. Some called her the woman who tamed the wild ones. Others muttered insults at her in the grocery store or glared as she walked Main Street. A few supporters sent notes, food, even anonymous donations left at her doorstep. One morning, as Hannah patrolled the boundary of her land, she heard the Mustangs before she saw them. The black stallion led the herd out of the trees, their coats slick from an early rain. The silver-gray Mustang limped, but his wounds were healing. The horses paused, heads high, watching her. Hannah's heart surged with pride and worry. She wondered if they understood the danger, the invisible war waged on their behalf. She moved closer, speaking softly, reassuring them. The black stallion didn't run. He lowered his head, acknowledging her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. But the threats weren't only from humans. Coyotes prowled closer, drawn by the chaos and the scent of blood from injured horses. One night, Hannah and Paul drove off a pair trying to corner a foal in the moonlight. Another evening, Jamie found a wounded mare and nursed her in the shadow of Hannah's barn until she could rejoin the herd. With each hardship, the line between Hannah and the Mustangs blurred a little more. She dreamed of running with them, wild and free, untethered by loss or fear. She understood now that defending them was not just about saving animals. It was about saving a piece of herself, a piece of the world worth fighting for. But the cost was mounting. The ranchers were growing more aggressive, threatening her friends, even hinting at legal trouble if she didn't back off. Some nights, headlights swept her windows, and once, she found her fence cut, her gate swinging open in the dark. Still, Hannah would not back down. She gathered her coalition and planned a protest at the county office. She showed the beads, the sketches, the burial site photos to anyone who would listen. She spoke to school children, wrote editorials, shared her story on social media. Each act of resistance was another line drawn in the dust. The prairie had become a battleground, and Hannah Prescott, once a quiet silversmith, had become its fiercest defender. And as the first frost touched the grass, she promised the Mustangs and herself that she would stand with the wild as long as she could draw breath. Autumn brought a hard, relentless wind, and with it, a sense of growing danger that seeped into every corner of Hannah's life. The protest at the county office had drawn attention, and so had the articles Hannah wrote for the local newspaper, each one painting the Mustangs as living legends, keepers of memory and wildness. For a few weeks, she sensed a shift, more townsfolk nodding in quiet support, a trickle of donations, a sheriff's deputy promising to look into the illegal traps. But underneath the surface, resentment grew. It was the kind of resentment that festered in whispers, at the diner, the hardware store, even outside the church on Sundays. Hannah's coalition stuck together, but there were only a handful of them against the tide of ranchers and skeptics. Still, she pressed on. The line between her world and the wilds had all but vanished now. Every waking thought was for the Mustangs. But trust, she would learn, is a fragile thing. One evening, after a long day checking fences and tracking the herd, Hannah returned home to find her neighbor, Tom Barlow, waiting on her porch. Tom was a stocky man with tired eyes and a farmer's tan, a fixture in the area for decades. He'd always been friendly enough, shared tools, checked on her during storms, even brought over extra eggs when his hens were laying well. Hannah greeted him, thinking nothing of it. He stood, shifting from foot to foot, not meeting her gaze. "Evening, Hannah," he said, voice gruff. "Just came by to see how you were holding up. Lot of talk in town lately." She offered a tired smile. "I'm managing, Tom. Trying to do what's right, that's all." They chatted for a few minutes. Nothing serious, or so it seemed. Tom asked about her repairs, the coalition, her health. He even brought her a jar of honey, pressed into her hands with a warm, if awkward, smile. When he left, she felt the first edge of hope in days. Maybe, she thought, the tide really was turning. That hope didn't last. 2 nights later, disaster struck. Jamie burst into Hannah's cabin, eyes wide with fear. "They found the burial ground," she gasped. "The one with the beads. You have to come. Now." The drive through the prairie night was frantic, headlights bouncing over rutted dirt. They reached the burial site to find a scene of devastation. The mound had been trampled, the sacred beads ripped away. Trash littered the ground, beer cans, cigarette butts, the telltale marks of ATVs. The earth was churned up, the old Mustang's resting place desecrated. Hannah knelt in the dirt, fists clenched, anger and grief flooding through her. This was no accident. Someone had led them here. Someone who knew exactly what that place meant. The truth struck her like a blow. Tom Barlow. He'd been asking questions, too many questions. He'd seen her sketches, heard her stories. Trust, once given freely, now felt like a weapon turned against her. The days that followed were the worst Hannah had known since her family died. The herd was scattered, spooked by the destruction. The black stallion led the survivors deeper into the hills, moving only at night. The silver-gray Mustang, once growing strong, was gone. Jamie and Paul spent hours searching the canyons for signs of stragglers, their faces tight with worry and exhaustion. The beads were missing, and word spread that someone had tried to sell them in town, but the details were always fuzzy. No one wanted to get involved. Mrs. Chang called in tears, saying her mailbox had been smashed, a dead crow left on her step. Carol found her barn doors chained shut. The sense of siege was everywhere, but for Hannah, defeat was not an option. If the Mustangs had taught her anything, it was how to fight for every scrap of hope. She called her coalition together, this time at night deep in the cottonwoods where the sound of the river covered their voices. Her hands shook as she laid out her plan. "We can't let them win," she said, voice fierce. "We move the herd. We get them out of sight until this blows over." Paul frowned. "That's a tall order, Hannah. Those horses know every inch of the prairie, but so do the ranchers." "We'll use their skills against them," Hannah replied. "We'll use what's left of the old cowboy ways. No trucks, no engines. Just us, on foot and horseback if we have to. We can lead them to the hidden valley up north. They'll be safe there." The group nodded, grim but determined. It was a crazy plan, but the only one they had. The operation unfolded over 3 nights. Guided by moonlight and every bit of knowledge they had, Hannah and her friends tracked the scattered herd, whispering softly to calm the skittish horses. Jamie used salt and apples as lures. Paul circled wide, driving stragglers back toward the main group. The black stallion watched everything, always a step ahead, but finally allowed Hannah close enough to brush his neck with her trembling hand. They moved slowly, using dry creek beds and narrow draws, staying clear of roads and fence lines. Twice they heard trucks rumbling nearby. Once, They lay flat in the grass for nearly an hour as men with flashlights searched the dark. Hannah's heart thudded so loudly she was sure the Mustangs could hear it. On the last night, exhausted and covered in dust, Hannah led the silver-gray Mustang into the hidden valley. The horses hesitated at first, then surged forward as if they understood. The valley was lush, sheltered by steep ridges and thick cottonwoods, a secret world, safe for now. As dawn broke, the herd gathered close, nickering softly. The black stallion lifted his head, eyes meeting Hannah's. For the first time, she saw not just wariness, but trust, a bond forged through hardship and courage. Hannah looked at her friends, bruised but triumphant. They had done the impossible. But in the quiet that followed, she felt the sting of betrayal, and the knowledge that, for the Mustangs and for herself, nothing would ever be the same again. The hidden valley felt like a miracle after so many weeks of fear. As the first light of day spilled over the ridges, Hannah stood at the edge of the grass and watched the Mustangs spread out. Cautious at first, their muscles taut with lingering anxiety, then loosening as they discovered the water, the shelter, the sweet grass beneath the trees. The air was sharp and clean. Somewhere nearby, a meadowlark sang, as if greeting them with a blessing. Hannah's coalition lingered at the valley's rim, exhausted but relieved. Jamie's cheeks were smudged with dirt and dried tears. Paul sat with his head in his hands, letting the stress finally catch up to him. Even Mrs. Chang managed a tired smile, her binoculars hanging around her neck. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. What mattered now was rest, for horses and humans alike. The days that followed were filled with cautious optimism. The Mustangs settled in quickly, the herd's natural rhythms reasserting themselves. The black stallion kept a constant watch on the valley's boundaries, while the mares and foals explored, their bodies gradually losing the stiffness of flight. Hannah visited every day, sometimes with apples or oats, but more often with nothing but her presence. She found herself humming as she walked among the trees, her hands busy with sketches, her heart lighter than it had been in years. But the fight was not over. Hannah knew that hiding the herd was only a temporary solution. The threats from the ranchers and poachers still lingered, resentment running through the town like a cold current beneath the thawing spring. Still, she sensed a subtle change. Word of her coalition's stand had begun to spread beyond the county. Wildlife advocates from as far away as Denver sent letters of support. A local journalist published a story that painted Hannah and her friends as quiet heroes. Small donations trickled in, envelopes marked only with first names or even left blank. One afternoon, Hannah returned to her cabin to find a plain manila envelope propped against her door. Inside were the stolen beads from the vandalized burial ground, along with a scrap of paper. The note read, "For the ones who remember." There was no signature. Hannah stared at the beads for a long time, the carved symbols catching the afternoon light. Tears pricked her eyes, not just from relief, but from the realization that there were still people out there willing to do what was right, even if they couldn't do it openly. That night, she called her coalition together in her kitchen. The beads were passed from hand to hand, reverently, each person tracing the symbols with their fingertips. "We need to tell the story," Hannah said, her voice strong. "Not just about the horses, but about everything we've learned. If we hide, the ranchers win. If we speak, maybe someone will listen." Mrs. Chang nodded. "Stories matter. People forget that. But stories change minds." So Hannah organized a gathering, part town hall, part celebration. She sent invitations to the local school, the library, the county office, even to ranchers who'd never spoken a kind word to her. She posted flyers at the feed store, the church, the gas station. A night for the wild ones. The story of the Mustangs. The turnout surprised everyone. Neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid her filled the folding chairs in the school gym. Children pressed close to the front, wide-eyed. There were skeptics and supporters, people from both sides of the fence, all drawn by curiosity or perhaps the hope of reconciliation. Hannah spoke first, her nerves steadied by the weight of what she had witnessed. She told the story of the funeral in the hills, the beads, the secret valley. She talked about what the wild herd had taught her, about loss, resilience, and the sacredness of memory. She passed the beads through the crowd and displayed her sketches. The herd at dawn, the black stallion's gaze, the burial mound beneath the juniper. Paul showed photos from the trail cams, foals leaping through the grass, mares grazing in the golden light, the herd gathering beneath the stars. Jamie read a poem she'd written, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. Even Mrs. Chang took the microphone, speaking about the old days, when wildness was part of everyone's life and not just a memory to be erased. A hush settled over the room as the stories washed over them. By the end of the night, something had shifted. Ranchers still grumbled, but their voices were softer. The sheriff approached Hannah, not with threats, but with a handshake. A local teacher offered to start a conservation club at the school. Even Tom Barlow, who had betrayed them, lingered at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable. Hannah met his gaze and gave a small nod, offering forgiveness, or at least a chance at peace. That spring, with the snowmelt turning the grass a vivid green, the hidden valley became a sanctuary not just for the Mustangs, but for the people of the town as well. Children visited with their classes, learning about wild horses and the need for stewardship. Neighbors brought apples, supplies, sometimes just a friendly word. The lines between us and them began to blur, replaced by a shared sense of wonder and responsibility. Hannah's story reached beyond Wyoming. Her sketches and journals were featured in a regional magazine. Wildlife experts visited, some bringing news of grants or protection status. For the first time, it seemed possible that the wild herd might endure, not just in secret, but as part of the landscape's future. And for Hannah, the valley was more than a victory. It was a place of healing, a space where grief softened into gratitude and loneliness gave way to community. Each evening, as the sun set behind the cottonwoods and the Mustangs grazed in peace, she felt a quiet certainty that hope, once kindled, could not easily be snuffed out. Hannah Prescott sat on the porch of her cabin, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the Wyoming prairie. The air was crisp with the coming fall, leaves turning gold and red on the cottonwoods that bordered the hidden valley. Around her, the world was quieter now, peaceful in a way she hadn't known for years. She gazed out toward the hills where the wild Mustangs roamed free, their coats shimmering in the sunlight. The black stallion led his herd through the tall grass, his movements steady and proud. Hannah smiled softly, feeling a deep sense of connection that went beyond words. Her journey had not been easy. The battles with ranchers, the betrayals, the nights spent watching over the herd had left scars, both physical and emotional. But through it all, she had learned what it truly meant to fight for something bigger than herself. Hannah pulled her journal onto her lap, fingers tracing the worn leather cover. She opened to a fresh page and began to write. The wild is not something to be tamed or controlled. It is a force of nature, a spirit that teaches us about freedom, resilience, and respect. The Mustangs have shown me the strength that comes from honoring the past while moving forward. She thought back to the moments that had defined her journey, the desperate cry at dawn, the circle of trust formed by the herd, the solemn burial of the old Mustang with its hand-carved beads. Each event had been a lesson, a reminder that even in the face of loss, there is hope. Her story had spread beyond the prairie. She had spoken at local schools, sharing her experiences with children who listened wide-eyed as she described the secret language of the Mustangs and the importance of protecting wild places. Conservation groups had invited her to conferences, where she emphasized the need for balance between human activity and nature. Hannah had even published a memoir, a collection of sketches, journal entries, and stories that captured the heart of the prairie and the spirit of the herd. Readers from across the country wrote to her, inspired by her courage and the message that true strength comes from compassion and understanding. But more than any recognition or success, Hannah cherished the quiet moments, the soft nickers of the foals at dawn, the rustling of the grass in the evening breeze, the feeling of belonging to something wild and untamed. She reflected on the bonds formed with her coalition, the friends who had stood by her through threats and hardship. Their shared purpose had created a community where once there had been isolation. Together, they had protected not only the Mustangs, but also a piece of the prairie's soul. Hannah knew the struggle to keep the wild safe was ongoing. The world was changing, and the pressures on the land and its creatures would continue. But she felt ready, grounded by the lessons learned and fueled by the hope that even small acts of kindness could leave lasting legacies. Closing her journal, Hannah rose and stretched, the cool air filling her lungs. She walked toward the edge of the valley, where the herd grazed under the watchful eye of the black stallion. He turned, meeting her gaze with calm intelligence. In that moment, Hannah understood that the greatest strength was not possession or control, but respect for freedom and story, the stories of those who came before, the lives intertwined with the land, and the wildness that lives within us all. She whispered a promise to the wind. "I will honor your stories, your freedom, and your spirit, as long as I live." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Hannah Prescott smiled, knowing that the prairie's lessons would guide her always. Years had passed since Hannah Prescott first heard the desperate whinny cutting through the misty Wyoming dawn. The prairie had changed with the seasons, as it always did, but something more enduring had taken root, a legacy of trust, healing, and wild freedom that would outlast any storm. On a crisp autumn morning, Hannah stood on a ridge overlooking the valley that had become the Mustang sanctuary. The wind tugged gently at her coat, carrying the scent of sage and earth. She watched with a quiet smile as a magnificent silver-gray Mustang led his herd across the golden grass, muscles rippling, mane catching the sunlight. The same horse she had saved years ago, strong, free, and whole. Her silver knife, once a tool of desperate rescue, hung from a leather thong around her neck, its handle worn smooth by years of use and memory. It had become more than metal and edge. It was a symbol of trust and sacrifice, passed down in her family and now shared with the wild ones who had taught her the meaning of connection. Hannah's cabin was nearby, filled with sketches, journals, and photographs chronicling the journey that had changed her life. Visitors often came, children eager to learn about the Mustangs, conservationists inspired by her story, neighbors curious about the woman who had stood for the wild. She greeted them all with warmth, her voice steady and sure. She spoke not only of horses but of the land and the fragile balance between humans and nature. She told stories of the herd's secret rituals, the beads left in honor, and the circle of trust forged through patience and respect. Her memoir, published years ago, had become a quiet bestseller in conservation circles. It was filled with art and words that captured the spirit of the prairie and the horses who lived there. Through it, Hannah hoped to inspire new generations to protect the wild places and the stories they held. As twilight deepened, Hannah wandered the prairie trails, the cool grass brushing her ankles. The sound of hooves echoed behind her, soft and rhythmic. She turned to see the black stallion, majestic and steady, walking beside the silver-gray Mustang. The herd followed close behind, a living tapestry of strength and freedom. Hannah knelt, reaching out to stroke the black stallion's sleek neck. His eyes met hers, deep and knowing. In that moment, she felt the full circle of her journey, the grief that had once isolated her, the bond forged in struggle, and the hope carried forward. She whispered, her voice barely louder than the breeze, "Thank you for trusting me, for letting me be part of your world." The horses nickered softly, a sound full of life and promise. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the prairie in hues of amber and rose. Years from now, Hannah knew, others would walk these lands and see the wild herd thriving, untamed and respected. Her silver knife would rest in a place of honor, an heirloom not just of family, but of a commitment to the wild and the free. The story of Hannah and the Mustangs would live on, whispered in the wind, etched in the grass, carried in the hearts of all who understood that true connection comes from respect, sacrifice, and the courage to let nature and ourselves be wild. Even the smallest act of kindness, she believed, could leave a legacy beyond a single lifetime. And so the prairie held its breath, the wild running free beneath an endless sky.